Welcome to Story Rhyme with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read part 1 of The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by JamesTucker. This story is about a convict to Australia. Well, let's begin. The Life of an Exile. Part 1, first. So this is the the facsimile of the title page of the original Ralph Rashleigh. JamesTucker wrote under the pseudonym Giacomo di Rosenberg. Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh, a penal exile in Australia, 1825 to 1844. With the introduction by the Right Honourable the Earl of Birkenhead, Jonathan Cape, 30 Bedford Square, London. Transcriber's note. Tucker wrote his autobiographical Ralph Rashleigh, or The Life of an Exile, in 1844. It was published in a heavily edited form in 1929, and his original manuscript was published in 1952. Below is a copy of the letter that caused him to be convicted of blackmail. Sir, you perhaps did not expect to hear from me so suddenly, but when you turned me away from Leytonstone for a mere trifle, that too at a time when by the late failures many scores of clerks were out of employ, you forgot that I had you in my power through your transactions with me 5 nights following. I have the dates and circumstances on paper written at the time, and that from your conduct to me before I went to live with you, you could expect no mercy from me. Did you not, however, let it pass? In a few words, I have taken advice upon the subject, and know that if you are obstinate, it is in my power to bring down ruin on your head, and infamy on your name. However, I will be merciful. Allow me to return to L in the same manner as before. I will never mention it again, as if I did I should lose everything and gain nothing. But it is impossible for me to get any situation in town at present. It is not true that Mrs. T advertised, as you said. She is in great distress, and she is my mother. Therefore, I would wish to afford her a little relief, if possible, so send me £5 to my address, which, with the other you lent me, I will owe you for the pay when I get a place. If I do not hear from you by Saturday morning, you will hear of it, enclosing £5. Now consider ruin and beggary on one side, and wealth and comfort on the other. Remember that, if you are obstinate, it will cost you all. Do as I say, it will cost you nothing. I wait your answer before I proceed. As yet, I have given Mr. Norris no names. On Saturday night, if you are silent, I will go too far to retract. Yours obediently, signed James Tucker Jr. And table of contents, publisher's note, advertisement, introduction, chapters 1 to 25. Publisher's note. Australia has long ago freed itself from the cloud of Botany Bay, and the ignominy of that first chapter of history is almost forgotten, even by those colonial families who can trace their ancestry back to the criminal colonies of Tasmania and New South Wales. Indeed, there are very scanty records of that early adventure when men as famous as Wainwright, who poisoned his cousin because her ankles were too thick, left the country for their country's good. A convenient fire destroyed most of the records some years ago, and hundreds of Australians sighed with relief and consigned their sheep-stealing, murdering, or revolutionary ancestors to the oblivion of a short memory. Now, the history of the colonies needs this particular exciting chapter to make it complete, for some great men went to New South Wales with shackles on their wrists. Some of them were architects and painters, writers and thinkers, grandfathers, any but the snobbish would be proud to own. The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh are therefore a rare and valuable record of an exciting aspect of colonisation. Since all such early records may come under the suspicion of the unbeliever, it is wise for us to explain the exact circumstances under which this manuscript has come into the limelight of print. It was sent to us by Mr. Charles H. Bertie, the well-known librarian of Sydney, New South Wales. Mr. Bertie explained to us that it had come into his hands from a man who had inherited it from his wife's father, in whose possession it had remained for 30 years. Mr. Bertie read the manuscript and was so sure of its importance that he had it typed and sent to us in England. We recognised its value and interest, but the archaic literary style of the writer made us doubt whether the book would be acceptable to modern readers. So the manuscript was rewritten, but with absolute fidelity to the original story. It has been translated from this archaic form without losing the vitality of the story or the intensity of the background. No incident of importance has been omitted and nothing added to the sense or colour of the original script. Following the typescript came the original manuscript from Mr. Bertie, an aged foolscap book of undoubted antiquity. The book contained the story of Ralph Rashleigh, written patiently and well in about 150,000 words. Some pages of this precious and ragged original are reproduced in this book, although their faint stains and yellowing edges are naturally lost in the process of reproduction. The author's name on the title page is given as Giacomo di Rosenberg, and upon one or two plays in manuscript which were found with the Rashleigh manuscript, the name of Otto von Rosenberg appears. From this conjunction of names, it would seem that both are variations of a pseudonym. There is also an introduction to the narrative, which is as follows. Advertisement. The tale contained in the following pages was compiled by the editor as it fell from the lips of the person who was at once the author and in some sort the hero of the adventures therein related, chiefly with the view to dissipate the ennui and vary the monotony at times inseparable from the circumstances of a life in the bush of Australia. As, however, the truth of many of the leading incidents is known to the editor personally, and that others have been vouched for by persons of undoubted veracity, it is now offered to the public, who, it is hoped, will receive it with the indulgence due to the rude, unadorned production of A Squatter, 31st of December 1845. It has been impossible to identify the squatter or the hero of the tale, although the events recorded have been verified, and there are 100 points which prove the narrative to be authentic. The name Ralph Rashleigh is admitted to have been an alias, and careful research into existing records suggests that it is actually an alias of an alias, since while one of the characters who was in Newgate prison with him has been authenticated in an ensuing footnote by an account of his trial in the Sessions Papers, there is no record of the trial of any man named Rashleigh for the crime recounted in the book. It would seem that every name, except those of public persons, which occurs in the narrative, has been deliberately altered. The reason for this is doubtless that the book was written and intended for publication very soon after the events with which it deals had occurred, and when many of the people mentioned were alive. The squatter's note is dated 31st of December 1845. Errors in the book occasionally serve to confirm its reliability. As an instance, Sir John Jameson, a well-known resident of Regentville at the time, is referred to as the Chief Justice. Sir James was not Chief Justice, but almost certainly he would have been chairman of the local bench of magistrates, since he was the most conspicuous resident of the neighbourhood of the Emu Plains agricultural establishment at which Rashleigh was employed. Convicts had only gossip on which to found information, and it would be intelligible for the Chief Magistrate to be described among them as Chief Justice, if justice is assumed to refer to a Justice of the Peace, and not to a position paralleling that of the Lord Chief Justice. The ship, the Magnet, in which Rashleigh was taken to Australia, has been authenticated. The places in which he was employed, and in which he lived, and the conditions prevailing during his sojourn in them are all correctly described. This was no work of an inventor of tales, but the labour of love of the squatter who made this very fair copy of the massed notes which he had written down as the tale fell from the lips of the person who was at once the author and in some sort the hero of the adventures therein related, chiefly with a view to dissipate the ennui and vary the monotony at times inseparable from the circumstances of a life in the bush in Australia. The diary is acknowledged to be one of the highest forms of literature and the most interesting form of history. Now come the diaries and personal records of the New World, and on the heels of the records of Aloysius Horn comes this diary classic from the Antipodes, authentic as to its origin and amazing for the picture it gives of the first dark chapter of the Genesis of Australia. Introduction. I am, on the whole, after consideration, of opinion that this remarkable volume of memoirs may be accepted as authentic. It records the life of a criminal who was convicted at the London Sessions of the crime of burglary just 100 years ago, and provides material for reflection to all who have an interest in the evolution of the penal code. It is a book which might be read with profit by those ultra-humanitarian persons who would remove almost entirely the punitive quality from the legal means which society adopts for the disciplining of its recalcitrant members. There is a powerful, because vociferous, minority of citizens who would abandon the death penalty utterly, even for the crimes of murder, high treason, piracy, and the causing of disaffection among His Majesty's forces. They are among the revolutionaries of law, and their activities must be restrained if the law of England is to remain the pattern of justice which it has been, and is still admitted to be, throughout the world. This man, Ralph Rashleigh, had the advantage of a decent upbringing, but, out of weakness of character, adopted what seemed the easier life of crime at an early age. After one short term of imprisonment for uttering spurious coins, he began to practice bolder and more profitable crimes, though never adopting violence towards any person in effecting his depredations. He was a mild-natured man, with no worse criminal instincts than those necessary to become a successful thief and burglar. The crime for which he was finally tried was not a very desperate venture, consisting merely of feloniously entering a private house and robbing the butler's pantry of the silver which was stored there. Such, it would be thought, in these days, was not a crime for which a man deserved to die by hanging, but this was the sentence first pronounced against Ralph Rashleigh. The capital sentence was commuted to transportation for life, and something of what it meant of hardship and suffering is recounted in the pages of this dark narrative. 100 years ago, and less sentences of this severity were passed as a matter of course upon all who committed crimes against property. The theft of a spoon, a handkerchief, any trifling object, was punishable by death, or transportation for periods of 7 or more years. It was not until 1861 that to hang a man for theft was completely abolished, but most cases of theft had by then ceased to be capital offences. In that year a series of statutes consolidating and amending the criminal law was passed, though not without considerable opposition from responsible authorities. There must therefore be alive at this time many people during whose lifetime men were actually sentenced to death for petty thefts, and whose contemporaries of childhood were transported as juveniles for such crimes. The Sessions papers of the period give many cases of boys of 15 and 16 who were sentenced to long terms of transportation for such petty thefts. The system of penal transportation, which was in operation at the time when the hero of this chronicle was sent out to New South Wales, was a development of what had been in operation for centuries. The Barbados and the West Indies had long before the beginning of last century been used as work asylums for criminals and prisoners of war and with the discovery of Australia, it was intelligible, though never defensible, that labour should be supplied in this manner for the opening and clearing of the country. It may be recalled that Cromwell had no compunction about shipping Irish and other prisoners of war to Jamaica to help in the conquest of that fever-infested island, and that further he dispatched thousands of Irish girls and women to become wives to his transportees. The living conditions of pioneers in any new and untamed country must always be harsh and meagre, and while in these softer times we may shudder at the extremities of hardship and misery endured by the convicts described in this book, it must be kept in mind that their conditions were hardly more onerous than those of the free population. Australia in the 1820s and 1830s was largely unexplored, and the white population was still severely taxed to win the bare means of existence from its soil. That the forced labour of the convict population was only made productive by the use of the lash and other harsh punishment was natural, but the position of a well-behaved man was not much worse than that of a seaman in the navy, or a deckhand on a clipper. Flogging had been for centuries a method of punishment in both the services, and the use of the belaying pin on shipboard was regarded as not only normal but justifiable. We need not, therefore, fling ourselves into overmuch emotion over the sufferings of the convicts of New South Wales, as they are recorded in this book. The transportation of criminals, under which Ralph Rashleigh served his sentence, worked admirably on the whole. The men could serve their term, obtain their freedom, receive a grant of land, and establish themselves as farmers and squatters, to live a healthier and more useful life than ever they would have done in their homeland. On the other side of the sheet is the record of gangs and outlaws and bushrangers, of whose practices this book contains a comprehensive survey. These men were rebels or criminals by nature. Desperate as their story is, it is not worse than that of the wild men in any new country. To name but one instance, there have been, within the memory of the present generation, gangs of desperate gunmen in the United States of America, whose activities matched in lawlessness those of the gangs of the Australian bushrangers. The evolution of a civilized society is a slow and painful process. The harshness of the laws under which it develops is seldom greater than is dictated by the needs of the community for its protection and peace. There is no just cause to feel shame that such experiences as are here recorded could befall Britishers. One may, perhaps, regard the disappearance of the transportation system and all that it connoted of human suffering with relief and satisfaction, but in a historical sense it can be said that the wisdom and justification of that system lay in the incontrovertible fact that it worked well. Birkenhead, the editor. Chapter 1. Ralph Rashleigh was the son of London shopkeepers of decent rank, received a sound education, and at the end of his schooling he was articled in an established conveyancer in the vicinity of Chancery Lane. At the termination of the second year of his training, it is known that, by virtue of a provision in his indentures whereby he was entitled to a small but sufficient allowance, he was able to leave his master's roof tree and live in a lodging of his own. He had been subject to the normal amount of discipline and surveillance until this freedom came to him, but there is no great evidence that he was harshly treated or that he was greatly irked by this restraint. Indeed, very little is known of his early youth, and nothing at all about his character and attainments as a child. Record is meagre, indeed, of the years prior to his assumption of the alias of Ralph Rashleigh. It is known that after attaining the freedom of a personal lodging, his chief concern, out of office hours, was to indulge himself in such pleasures as his slender means afforded. He was a weak, easy-going fellow, not positively vicious, but apt to pursue any reasonably safe course which would add to his means of living flashily as a man about town. His legitimate means being scanty, He was prevented from going to excess with his tavern companions, and from exercising the more expensive pleasures. He was a man tasting and savouring fragments of dishes, the whole of which only could have satisfied his taste and hunger. His appetite for the lighter satisfaction of life was continually whetted, but never really satisfied. There was among his acquaintance a young articled clerk, similarly circumstanced to himself, who seemed not to be under any monetary disability. Rashleigh came to know that Hartop, as the man was named, had no private means, and he began to wonder at his ability to spend in a single night's drinking more than Rashleigh himself could afford to spend in a week. Evidently Hartop knew of some way to come by money which was outside his friend's experience, and Rashleigh waited for an occasion to discover what the particular trick of Midas might be. The opportunity occurred one night when unrestrained drinking had reduced them both to the condition in which reserves vanished and confidences are carelessly exchanged. Rashleigh, as Hartop ordered another generous round of drinks, asked him bluntly how he managed to spend so much money on drink and pleasure. "You are only an articled clerk, like myself, yet you seem to have 10 times as much cash as I. How do you manage it?" he asked. Then Hartop told him how simply it was. He was in touch with coiners of spurious sovereigns, who sold them to him at a reasonable rate, which left a considerable profit to the purchaser. There was, of course, a certain element of risk in changing and passing them, he explained, but that risk could be reduced very simply to a minimum. A single rule of action solved the whole problem. This was, never to have more than one spurious coin on one's person at any time, and, if possible, always to have a genuine sovereign with which to replace the counterfeit, should it be detected. The visions of comparative wealth which the prospect conjured up in Rashleigh's mind made the risks and the criminality of the affair dwindle into insignificance, and he eagerly accepted Hartop's offer to supply him in a few days with 20 spurious sovereigns. He was the more blinded to the dangers of the course, which he was so wholeheartedly ready to take up, by the immunity from them which his friend had been fortunate enough to enjoy. Hartop related experiences of his own in disposing of the coins, which made safety seem utterly assured, provided one followed the one golden rule. For long the event seemed to prove that one could escape detection with the ease and impunity which Hartop claimed. Rashleigh discovered himself cunning and resourceful as a petty malefactor, and his success in the disposal of spurious sovereigns removed the spur which had hitherto kept him to his work. He abandoned his habits of punctuality and industry, and became insufferably negligent and careless. The remonstrances and advice of his principal were ineffectual, and in a few months the exasperated conveyancer dismissed him and cancelled his articles. The success of his new, dishonest method of securing his needs and occasional luxuries made this apparent calamity appear as a relief to Rashleigh, who, however, was astute enough to realise that he must effect some legitimate occupation in order to allay suspicion. His work had developed him into a penman of surpassing capacity, both as to speed and beauty in the writing of legal documents, and he resolved to set himself up as a law scrivener. His regime thereafter was to work as a freelance for 2 or 3 hours a day in his lodging, and to spend the rest of his time wherever in and around London he could count upon opportunities for disposing of his coins. For some time his success and immunity continued, and when he ventured farther afield, to fairs and races in the country, his prosperity increased. He discovered from experience that country people were easy victims, and he decided to abandon the golden rule of carrying only one counterfeit coin at a time. He went to Maidstone to attend the annual fair, was forced to submit to being searched when a townsman made an outcry at receiving from him a spurious sovereign, and a second counterfeit being found on his person, he was arrested and committed for trial upon a charge of uttering counterfeit coins. At the next assizes, he was found guilty and sentenced to 12 months imprisonment with hard labour. In the 1820s, although prison treatment was severe to harshness, its discipline did not include the banning of free speech between prisoners. Rashleigh was set to the tasks of picking oakum and beating hemp in the company of other criminals, many of whom were experts in crime. In their perverse vanity, these old hands boasted of their achievements in the past and detailed their plans for future coups when liberated should be theirs again. Rashleigh speedily became a humble and eager disciple, studying assiduously all that he could learn of the art and craft of crime. At the end of his term, he was released and walked out of prison a master craftsman of his illegal trade, anxious to put to practical tests the theoretical knowledge which he had acquired. His immediate plan of action had long been mature in his mind. An old cranksman had told him of a jeweller's shop in the city of Winchester, which could be easily and profitably rifled, and the two had agreed to make the attempt together as soon as his informant was released. Confident of his capacity, Rashleigh decided to commit the robbery single-handed, without waiting for his associate, and on his release proceeded immediately to London, where he converted into cash such possessions as he had left there in store. He next went to an address given him by a fellow prisoner and purchased a full equipment of burglar's tools. These he packed into a bag with a complete change of clothing, and without delay took coach to Winchester. There he put up at a small inn on the outskirts of town, and after eating dinner, found his way to the shop which he proposed to burgle. The directions and details given him by his informant proved correct, and having entered the shop and purchased a small trinket, he returned to the inn possessed of all the information he required for the completion of his plans. He supped early, paid his bill, and went to bed, leaving instructions with the landlord that he was to be called at 2 o'clock in the morning, at which hour a coach would be due to start for Portsmouth. It was a sleety November night, utterly dark, as he walked through the empty ancient streets to recommence his criminal career. It was such a night as no sane person would venture out into unless compelled, and Rashleigh reached the shop without meeting a soul. He set to work swiftly, and with chisel, brace, and bit and hacksaw removed the panel of the protecting shutter. Cutting the glass and removing the wire grating presented no difficulty, and he was about to load himself with booty from the window when the raucous voice of a watchman crying the hour gave him pause. He quickly pinned a sheet of dark brown paper over the panel opening and hurried to concealment in an ancient dark archway, a few doors from the jeweller's. The inclemency of the night favoured him. The watchman did his duty faithfully but swiftly, and observed nothing as he hastened by on his way back to the warm comfort of the watch-house. As the sound of his retreating footsteps grew faint, Rashleigh returned to the shop, filled his bag, his pockets, and his hat with gold, silver, and gems, and replaced the paper screen to postpone discovery as long as possible. Thrilled with success, he made his cautious way to the wood which he had selected as a hiding place on the previous day, and buried his booty carefully. He then set out to place as long a distance as possible between himself and Winchester by daybreak, by which time he found he had covered 24 miles. He breakfasted at a wayside public house, after which he mounted a passing coach to Farnham, and determined to stay a day or two in that town. He took a room at a small inn there, and spent the hours of daylight sleeping away the fatigue of his night's work. In the evening he rose and went downstairs to the bar parlour, where he heard news of his recent depredation. A man had just arrived from Winchester, and was recounting to the assembled company the details of the most audacious robbery which had occurred in that city during the previous night. Rashleigh called for a drink and listened with unapparent interest. The man's story was that £1,500 worth of jewellery had been stolen from a Winchester shop, and that the whole city was in a ferment of excitement and conjecture. The local opinion was that the robbery had been committed by a gang of expert thieves. The magistrates had already exclaimed all the loose and suspicious characters among the less fortunate residents, and had filled their day with a mort of arrests, searchings and questionings, such as had not troubled Hampshire since. As the man put it, William Rufus, the king, was found dead of an arrow. Finally, the distracted magistrates, as eager to act as to talk, had arrested 2 harmless sailors begging their way to Portsmouth, and had sent the pair of them to jail for 6 months, because the only account of themselves which they could give was the truth itself. Rashleigh heard the tale with relief, touched with ironic amusement. No suspicion attached to him yet. That was clear and comforting. It was, however, too soon to attempt to remove his plunder from its hiding place in the woods. Yet he disliked the idea of going so far away as London. He therefore decided to visit some relatives who lived at Southampton, as if he were still employed as a lawyer's clerk and was taking a holiday. During his stay at Southampton, an adventure befell Rashleigh, which was, unknown to him, premonitory of a still more desperate one which was to occur to him in later years. He had taken advantage of a fine winter day to walk out to Netley Abbey, a noble pile of ruins in the New Forest, and, lingering later into the afternoon than was discreet, he lost his way back to town. It was dark before he hit upon a beaten path which appeared to run in the right direction, but after walking along it for some distance, he discovered himself on the western bank of Southampton Water, among ruins and rocks. Rashleigh had all a townsman's fear of darkness in open country, and his anxiety was not lessened by the recollection that he had heard his relatives speak of ruins on this part of the coast as being the haunt of deer stealers, smugglers, and others living on the fringes of outlawry. It was therefore with considerable caution and a sense of uneasiness that he stumbled towards the only light which was visible in the November blackness. He had gone only a few yards when the light disappeared, to show again some minutes later, half inclined to think that the light, which continued to show only spasmodically, must be the will-o'-the-wisp of which he had heard. He was on the point of abandoning its guidance, when he was startled to hear a voice, near yet below him, cry out, "Bob! Bob! Is it all right?" Immediately the light shone very close, and Rashleigh dropped silently to the grass-covered ground, quaking with fear. He saw that the light shone from a lantern in the hands of a tough-looking sailor, whose murderous expression made it clear that the pistols stuck in his belt were rather for use than ornament. "Is Curtis in sight?" called the voice below. "No, he ain't," answered the lantern-bearer gruffly, walking forward and appearing to meet the ascending man behind a crumbling wall, which hid them from the view of the scared onlooker. The conversation between them made him crouch low and motionless. "It's damn strange," said the first speaker. "Sure it is, ain't? I don't like the looks of it," said Bob. "It can't be for fear of the hawks, and he ain't turned up," continued the other. "They are all off the White on the lookout for Jack Simmons. He sent a note to an old pard of his at Cowes, a purpose so it got into the hands of the preventive man. Wrote that he would try it on tonight at Black Gang, or the Undercliff, and I heard as how the Southampton and Portsmouth cutters, with all the spare officers, have been sent over to the island." The men were obviously uneasy, and Rashleigh gathered from the snatches of the ensuing talk that they feared that they might have been sold by their spy in the preventive service. Then the conversation ended, and for some minutes Rashleigh lay wondering how he was ever going to get out of the fix he was in. "By cripes, there she is!" The excited exclamation was immediately followed by a loud, long whistle obviously a prearranged signal. Instantly, the quiet and stillness were broken by the sound of trampling horses all around the spot where Ralph lay hidden. Next, the splash of oars told him that a boat was approaching. He raised his head to look and saw 3 boats pull ashore. Numbers of men immediately surrounded them and unloaded their cargoes with frantic haste, using as few lights and making as little noise as possible. Swiftly, the contraband was tied on the backs of the waiting horses and placed in 2 light wagons, which had been brought down to the shore when the signal had been given. Suddenly another whistle sounded, and startled heads were raised among the smugglers as it was repeated at a little distance. "The Hawks! Blast them! They're coming!" Rashleigh heard the exclamation, broken in low, vicious tones. The smugglers gathered into a group, apparently taking orders from their leader. "Jump now, you swine," he heard the men say. "Drive off them wagons and horses, while we keep the bleeders back for a bit. Get away with the swag, get!" Wagons and horses disappeared at a gallop into the darkness, evidently taking some track which Rashleigh had failed to observe. The remaining smugglers dropped prone to earth, or sheltered behind rocks and ruined walls, as a strong patrol of the Coast Guard advanced round the projecting point, visible because of the lynx torches which they carried, throwing a wavering light over the scene, so that Rashleigh, now frantic with fear, could see the lugger offshore crowding all her canvas to make a getaway. The Coast Guard party fired a few shots at her, but made no attempt at pursuit, confining their efforts to the capture of the landed cargo. They came towards the place where the concealed smugglers lay, the lights they carried rendering them easy targets. As soon as they were within shore range, the flashes of 20 muskets stabbed the darkness. 2 officers fell, and the remainder retreated quickly out of danger. They next attempted to outflank the enemy, and turned inland, only to find themselves exposed to a punishing volley from the snugly concealed gang. The patrol returned the fire as best they could, shooting more or less blindly at the spots where the musket flashes revealed the presence of the smugglers. In desperation, the leader of the king's men, calling upon his followers, charged in among the smugglers, who, firing a final volley, leaped up and met the cutlasses of their attackers with clubbed guns. Chance alone saved Ralph from being trampled upon and shot, while the melee went on all around where he lay, shivering with fright. The opposing leaders met in personal combat only a few yards away, to be joined by their followers. Sudden cheers, mingled with curses and imprecations against the Hawks, broke from the inland wood as a reserve of smugglers came to the assistance of the gang. At this, the Coast Guards seized their officers and insisted upon withdrawing from a now hopelessly unequal fray. Shots were exchanged as they retreated in good order along the beach, but the smugglers made no attempt at pursuit. Instead, they began hurriedly searching for their dead and wounded comrades. Lanterns were lit, and Ralph mastered his quaking limbs and lay shamming dead. A man held a lantern over him and uttered a cry of surprise at finding someone who, by his dress, was obviously neither smuggler nor preventive man. "Who in hell's this?" he cried. "Here, Jack, here's a gunman. Let's run through his pockets anyhow." The man addressed, a fierce-visaged, whiskered ruffian, came up and held the lantern close to Rashleigh's face. By the hokey, he ain't dead. He's either shamming or he's in a swoon." "Shake a leg there, you two," came the leader's voice. "We have got to get going, and quick. What you hanging about for?" "Here's a bloke as pretended to be dead," answered Jack. "By his dress, reckon he's a spy." "A spy? Hey," said the leader. "We'll put him from pretending death any more, ever. He shall swing from the Bewley yoke before the night's an hour older." What self-possession Rashleigh had managed to retain left him in a swirl of utter panic, but all his wild babblings for mercy were ignored. Seizing him by the arms, Jack and his companion hurried him along at a run between them. They were in the wake of the retreating gang and feared to lose contact, and consequently paid attention to nothing but the direction from which occasional guiding whistles came. At the end of the run, which Ralph guessed must have been 3 miles. They came to a halt in a forest clearing, in the centre of which was an enormous and ancient oak. The smugglers' leader, with 2 other men, stood at the foot of the tree and immediately asked Rashleigh who he was. The unfortunate man answered in a voice stammering with terror by telling the simple truth, explaining how he came to be on the shore when the raid occurred. "A damn fine tale," replied the smuggler. "You are a blasted spy, and you are going to die in a suitable way, at the bite of this good rope. You, Bill, count 100, and Harry and Jack, you stand by ready to string this young shaver up when Bill's done." Confronted with the actual rope and the tree and the menace of the callous leader's manner, Rashleigh was crazed with fear. In less than 2 minutes he had to face God, with a daring crime at his last significant achievement. For years he had forgotten God, and all that august name connoted, and at the blinding realization that he was about to meet his fate as a criminal, the fear of hell became real. He dropped on his knees before his contemptuous persecutor and begged for pity, and swore by everything holy and unholy that he was no spy. Might he be struck dead if he had not spoken truth. He might have been speaking to one deaf and dumb for all the effect his pleadings had upon the smuggler. He came out of his agony of wild, plunging terror as he realized that the man called Bill was counting and had reached 64. "I'll give you everything I possess," screamed Rashleigh. "Only let me go." 65. 66. The smuggler caught up the rope and began to prepare the knot for the noose. 68. 69. Until then, only the grip of the 2 men on his arms had kept him from sinking in a collapse upon the ground, but the sight of the leader running the rope through the knot horrified him. Strung with despair, he broke from his captors, snatched up a gun which stood against a tree, and dealt the chief so sound a blow on the head that the smuggler crashed sprawling to the ground, and the gun broke off at the breech, leaving only the barrel in his hands. Before the others had recovered their wits, he leapt away across the clearing for the forest. The smuggler who pursued him was fleet of foot, and Rashleigh, glancing back, saw that he was gaining on him. He dodged round sharply, hoping to lay him out also with a surprise blow, but slipped and fell in a heap. His pursuer wrestled the gun barrel from him, struck him twice with it, and proceeded to drag him back to the tree of doom. He was no match for the smuggler, and could only struggle ineffectually while shouting for help. The second smuggler joined his confederate, and between them took him back to their chief, whose head, bleeding profusely, was being bound up by the man Jack. He greeted Rashleigh with a grim laugh. "So ho, my shaver, you thought you'd settle me, eh?" he said, "but Long Frank has got a tougher nut than you can crack. Now, lads, stop gaping. The end of the rope over that bough, and fix the noose round that bloody pup's neck. We'll choke him good and hearty." The men obeyed with alacrity. The noose, feeling cold and rough against his skin, was adjusted round his neck. 3 men laid hold of the loose end of the rope, and Rashleigh, struggling madly, felt the tautening, and then his feet left the ground. "Ho, you blasted thieves! We've got you at last!" Rashleigh heard the thunderous voice just as he raised his hands to clutch the rope round his neck, and the next instant found himself miraculously in a heap on the grass. Picking himself up in a daze, he saw the 3 men who had been pulling on the rope struggling in the grasp of a number of armed men, who speedily overpowered them. The smuggler chief and Jack had disappeared. All this Rashleigh realized in a flash, and was immediately surrounded by members of the crowd who had so opportunely arrived. He judged them from their dress to be gamekeepers, and found that his conjecture was right. They had been out in search of deer stealers, when his cries for help had brought them to the spot at a run. Ralph told his tale and thanked them, and agreed to accompany them to Southampton, whither they proposed to escort the 3 captured smugglers. Before the strangely assorted party had gone a mile, 2 decent-looking men came up and, taking the head gamekeeper to one side, talked earnestly with him. Presently, Ralph was beckoned over to the little group, and asked by the newcomers whether he would agree not to charge the smugglers if a certain sum of money were paid him. The gamekeeper, in whose view smuggling was a much milder crime than deer stealing, raised no objection to freeing his prisoners, and Ralph was only too eager to agree to a course which would put money in his pocket and at the same time make it unnecessary for him to appear before a magistrate. So it was settled that he would forgive his persecutors on receipt of a sum of £20. The bargain was confirmed over a smoking breakfast in an alehouse on the border of the forest, Rashleigh receiving one half of the agreed sum then, and arranging to call at the inn that evening to receive the balance. He then left the company to pursue the obvious intention of getting drunk together, and went home to his anxious relatives. In the evening he returned to the inn, received the balance of the money, and a few days later bade his relatives farewell and went to Portsmouth for a week. It was now 3 weeks since he had robbed the Winchester jeweller, and he judged it safe to return to that city to spring his plant. He purchased a travelling trunk and went by coach to the scene of his first major crime. He unearthed his plunder and carried it safely to his inn in the evening, without any untoward incident troubling him. The following morning he arrived with his packed trunk in London and sought out a fence, a receiver of stolen goods, who had been recommended to him by one of the old lags he had met in jail. He presented himself at a dingy marine store in a court leading to the Minories, expecting to find in Mr. Jacobs the traditional type of Jewish old-clothes merchant. Instead, a man in the prime of life, well clothed, and with every sign of respectability, came into the shop at his summons, and on hearing Rashleigh speak the password which he had learnt in prison, made an appointment to call at his lodgings next morning to discuss the business. Rashleigh prepared a list of the articles he had to sell, and had ready a few specimens when Jacobs arrived. The fence had a good reputation among his criminal customers, but Rashleigh was taking no chances. When the fence arrived, he was kept in ignorance of the fact that the goods were in the house. He went carefully over the list and examined the specimens in a business-like way, and then turned to Rashleigh. "Well, how much you want for the lot?" he asked. "In round figures, £1,000, answered Rashleigh. He smiled at the racial gesture of consternation with which the Jew greeted this announcement. £1,000? Mein Gott, are you mad? Where you think all that monies shall come from?" demands Jacobs. "Come now, Mr. Jacobs," said Rashleigh. "You know that you could find 20 times that amount if the goods were there. It's a bargain I'm offering you. I tell you how it is then. Money is so scarce these days, and besides, if I borrow the money to pay for it all this junk, when the devil do you think I get it back? Tell me that." "Oh well, if money is as scarce as all that, Mr. Jacobs," answered Rashleigh, "you can buy half of what is on the list. We can divide them into 2 heaps and toss up for first choice." Jacobs caught at this suggestion, and offered £300 for the fair half. Rashleigh countered by demanding 350. "Not I," retorted Jacobs finally. "Shall I go?" "If you won't give me what I want, you may as well go." The Jew went to the door and partly opened it, then suddenly returned to whisper confidently in his customer's ear, "I will give you £640 for the lot." Rashleigh shook his head, and the Jew fairly ran out of the room and down the stairs. A few minutes later he returned, as Rashleigh expected he would do, and concluded the bargain at £650, paying down Bank of England notes on the spot, and taking the portmanteau and jewellery with him. Happy in the consciousness that he had successfully completed his first big achievement in the new career which he had learnt in prison, Rashleigh settled down to enjoy the life of unimaginative dissipation for which he had traded his honour and his integrity. Theatres, gaming houses, and women soon absorbed the money which such hard bargaining had won from Jacobs the Jew, and only months had passed before he found himself again practically penniless. Whilst he was questing round for some opportunity to renew his fortunes, he met by chance a girl who had been in the service of his old employer. In those early days, he had had an affair with her under his employer's roof, and he found her ready to resume it. She told him that she was now in the service of an elderly gentleman of great wealth in Welbeck Street. Rashleigh saw his chance, and cultivated her liking for him with ardour, so that very soon he had gained admittance to her master's house, where he made love to her while acquainting himself with all the details he needed to know. His intention was to break into the house and steal the valuable silver, which he had learnt from his paramour was kept in the butler's pantry. In a short time he had everything he needed for his plan of plundering the silver, except an accomplice, and an accomplice was essential. It almost seemed as if fate were eager to give him all the assistance he needed for his schemes, for he met almost at once one of his one-time companions in prison, who had only recently been discharged and was penniless. He was ready for anything that would make him some money, and gladly agreed to Rashleigh's proposal. He also undertook to find that at night a hackney coachman that could be relied upon to do what he was told and keep silent. Rashleigh's plan being now complete, he decided to act at once. At midnight they went to the house with the necessary house-breaking implements, and Rashleigh entered it by means of the circular coal plate in the pavement, this being the only detail which had necessitated an associate. The other man replaced the coal plate and walked away, the understanding being that he should return in half an hour. In less than half the time he had allowed, Rashleigh had removed all the plate from the pantry and had locked himself with his spoil beside him in the cellar. No hitch occurred. His confederate received the plate through the coal hole. Rashleigh climbed out, the coal plate was replaced, and the pair drove to a furnished room at Paddington, which he had rented the day before. Next day he went to a famous fence in St. Mary Axe, and came away with £200, which he shared with his accomplice. Chapter 2. It was only a few weeks after the Welbeck Street burglary that Rashleigh's quick wits led him to undertake the crime which at once taxed his endurance to the limit, and provided him with money to an amount which might have rendered it unnecessary for him to pursue the career into which his weakness had drifted him. It happened as he was walking down Lombard Street on a Thursday that he noticed that a great common sewer was open for repairs, and also that there was an important bank a few yards from the opening. On the instant he decided to rob the vaults, which, he guessed, would in the ordinary course be situated in the basement, and therefore probably accessible from the sewer. He entered the bank on the pretext of making an inquiry regarding the failure of some country bank, and was kept waiting for some minutes, owing to the number of customers who were there on business. This brief time he had used to take in all around that he could regarding the building. The narrowness of the frontage confirmed his belief that there was no space on the ground floor for a strong room, which he concluded must therefore be below stairs. He determined to make his attempt to rob the place on Saturday, and made everything ready during the 2 days which followed his astute conjecture, telling the people with whom he lodged that he was going into the country until Monday. He set out at about 8 o'clock in the evening, with a carpet bag containing all the implements he would need, and a sufficient supply of food and spirits. This bag he concealed by wearing a long boat cloak. On reaching the city, he went into a coffee room until it was well past 11 o'clock, when he paid his reckoning and went by a circuitous route to Lombard Street. Arriving there about midnight, it had come on to rain heavily, so that he met no one, not even a watchman, as he approached the opening of the sewer. He got into it and reached the bottom safely. He groped his way cautiously along the sewer, noting the side drains as he went, until he came to the one which, according to his calculations, should be the one beneath the bank. Supplying himself with a light by means of phosphorus and a wax paper, he crept along the branch drain, sounding its sides until a hollow noise suggested that he was beside one of the walls enclosing the bank basement. He then proceeded to remove the bricks, stripping to the waist, as the closeness of the drain, combined with the strain of working hard in so cramped a position, made him sweat profusely. Steadily and indefatigably he worked, prizing out brick after brick. Losing count of time, it was not for nothing that this section of the sewer was under repair, and two happenings warned him in time of the danger of the feat he was undertaking. First, a crash startled him, and he was almost choked with dust and powdered mortar. When this had settled, he saw by taper light that several yards of the crown and sides of the drain had collapsed, the debris completely blocking his way out. He went to work again, unalarmed by this, confident of being able to get out some other way, once he had got into the vaults. The incident had, however, made him cautious, and he proceeded more carefully, keeping a watchful eye on the wall on which he was working. It was thus that he noticed in time that the wall above the hole which he was making had begun to crack, and that, unless he took instant measures, it would soon fall and crush his life out. He crawled away rapidly to a sound part of the drain, and had scarcely reached safety when the cracking wall caved in, bringing with it a large piece of the drain, which struck Rashleigh on the head and knocked him senseless. When he came to his senses, he discovered with dismay that he was lying in a considerable depth of water. He groped and found his phosphorus bottle and his tapers, which luckily had not been buried, and having lit the paper, he burrowed under the broken bricks until he recovered his bag, in which he found his spirit flask unbroken. A good pull at this revived him sufficiently to enable him to investigate the ruins of his many hours of work. He was elated to find that the collapsing walls had left a breach through which he saw that there was some kind of a cellar within. He cautiously enlarged the opening, gathered his tools into his bag, and entered. A brief exclamation of the place filled him with chagrin and despair. Packing cases, old hampers, broken bottles, and piles of straw was all he found, and a strong smell of drugs. He realized with an empty feeling in the pit of his stomach that he had actually entered the basement of the house next to the bank, which he recollected was occupied by a wholesale druggist. He sat down fatigued and disheartened at the negation of all his labour and danger, and took another pull at the flask. The spirit put new heart into him, and he determined to try the other side of the drain so long as there was time safely to stay in the sewer. It was only 6 o'clock in the morning, and as it was Sunday, he had the whole day for uninterrupted working. This time he worked with more circumspection, and after about 2 hours, by which time his hands were dreadfully galled and blistered, he had made an opening large enough to crawl through. A single glance in the light of his taper assured him that he had made no second mistake. Investigation showed several cases of silver and copper money, and several small cases, which he prized them open. He found to contain only blanks of banknotes. Then he found a case of bill stamps, and he was beginning to think that his night of tormenting labour was to prove practically unrewarded, when he came upon a toughly made chest of antique design. It was strongly clasped and padlocked, and resisted all his attempts to open the lid. Sweating and breathless from his exertions, he sat down on the chest, his brain working desperately, furious at being balked when treasure was within an inch of his hands. He sprang up suddenly and heaved the chest over until it stood before him bottom up. He recollected having heard from an experienced thief in jail that a chest of this kind could often be opened at the bottom, if there had been any chance of damp collected under and around it, which causes the wood to rot. A careful examination proved that the bottom of the chest was indeed almost rotten, and in a few minutes he had broken it away. At what he found within, all the toil and moil and danger were forgotten, bags of coined gold, and a case of Bank of England notes waiting there for him to take. He emptied his carpet bag and stuffed it with as many sovereigns as he could carry, and then crammed in every banknote that he could lay his hands on, until he judged that he had about £10,000. He then hid all his implements and went back to the adjoining house, where he made up a bed of straw in the most out-of-the-way corner that he could find. After eating a hearty meal of the food which he had brought with him, he lay down and slept. He awoke at about 6 in the evening and decided to explore all the druggist's cellars with a view to discovering whether there was some way out other than the choked-up drain. The idea of removing all that heap of bricks and rubbish was something he could scarcely bear to contemplate. Rested though he was, after examining every inch of the cellar's floor space, he came at last upon a grating in a corner, which, on being raised, proved to open into the main sewer. He returned to his straw couch and waited impatiently for 12 midnight to strike. All his anxiety to be gone did not overcome his caution, as at that hour the city was practically certain to be deserted on the Sunday night. Midnight came at last, and he got through the grating, carrying his bag of booty, and crept silently towards the opening of the sewer. Listening attentively, he waited until no sound of footsteps or anything else broke the silence of the sleeping city, and then clambered up into the street. The night was as dark as it had been at Winchester, and rain was still falling steadily, but Rashleigh's elation at the favourable conditions was short-lived, as he made his way to the footpath. A watchman stepped suddenly out from a doorway and stood before him. Rashleigh was startled, but kept cool. "Good night, watchman," he said in his blandest tones. "Good night, sir," returned the watchman, a note of surprise in his voice. "Do you know, I thought I saw you come out of that big hole." Rashleigh laughed with the man at the absurdity of the idea, and breathing deeply with relief at avoiding another awkward contretemps, walked on. No hackney coach being attainable at that hour, he went down to the river to a house which he knew was kept open all night for the convenience of passengers arriving by the late packet boats, booked a room, and being too excited to sleep, spent the night alternately feasting his imagination on the future and reading a book which he found in his bedroom. In the morning he took boat up to Lambeth and breakfasted, going to his lodgings by hackney coach immediately after his meal. He concealed all his gold and notes, except about £100, and departed by coach for the city. Here, by adroit questioning and listening, he learnt that the police were baffled by the crime, and had that morning arrested all the workmen employed in the repairing of the sewer, so that they could all be closely questioned. As a number of the workmen had not returned to work, there were some grounds for the suspicion of the authorities that the gang was concerned in the robbery. Placards offering a reward of £500 for the detection of the guilty parties were already posted outside the Guildhall. Rashleigh stayed that night at the Swan with Two Necks, in Lade Lane, and next morning continued his inquiries. He, posing as a visitor from Bristol, chatted with a civic functionary at the Guildhall, from whom he learnt that the watchman who had accosted him on Sunday night in Lombard Street had come forward and told his tale. In spite of the fact that the magistrates could make nothing of this information, Rashleigh was alarmed, and content with what he had learned, took coach at once for his favourite retreat, at Farnham in Surrey. Here he decided to remain until it would be safe to return to his lodgings, pack his spoil, and leave for foreign parts. He had heard that all the ports were being closely watched, and therefore he did not dare to make a precipitate flight. About a fortnight later, he was sitting at breakfast in the inn, when he read in a newspaper that which made him leave his breakfast unfinished, and leave immediately for London. Essex Street, Strand, where he lodged, had been burnt down, one side of the street having been entirely gutted. Sick with apprehension, he took the first available coach, which landed him in the evening at the Golden Cross, Charing Cross. He raced up the Strand to Essex Street, and at a single glance he knew that complete loss had befallen him. Only the shell remained of the house in which he had lodged. It was a blackened ruin, and its walls were being demolished by an emergency gang of workmen, as they were in danger of falling. Half demented with rage, Ralph Rashleigh went into a neighbouring tavern and drank himself into a state of oblivion. That was part 1 of the story of The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by JamesTucker. I hope you got something out of that. Ralph seemed to get up to a few crimes. That jeweller's store, he got about £680, I think they said. That's about £80,000 in today's money, or 160,000 Australian dollars. Anyway, I guess I'll say goodbye now. Until next time, I wish you well.